Good afternoon, and welcome to the first installment of Camp Prosperity 2023, Turning Insights into Action, Data-Driven Policy Solutions. Before we dive on into the conversation, just a few housekeeping notes. This webinar is being recorded and will be mailed to registrants and available online within 1 week. All webinar attendees are muted to ensure sound quality. However, we want you to engage with us. Ask a question or share your thoughts at any time using the question box on your GoToWebinar control panel. And if you're experiencing any technical issues, please email gotomeeting@prosperitynow.org. Here's how to get the most out of today's call. Join from a quiet space. Grab a coffee or snack and settle in. Like I said previously, engage. Send us your questions and comments as you listen. And tweet with us on Twitter using the hashtag #CampProsperity. And finally, reflect on ways to apply what you learned today to your own work. And now, Vanna Cure.
Thank you, Justin, and welcome everyone to Camp Prosperity 2023. As you all know, I'm Vanna Cure. I serve as Associate Director for Advocacy here at Prosperity Now, but my title at this time of year is always your lead camp counselor. We are in our 6th year of hosting Camp Prosperity. We are always excited to host this series. And we designed it to help build the advocacy skills of our community of state-based organizations and to be able to connect our network of advocates with one another through this experience and share advocacy success stories, some challenges, and some questions that you may have related to advocacy. So please utilize the questions box, the chat box to really communicate with one another. We'll be communicating on Twitter as well. And then we also shared ways that you can join our advocacy listserv to continue the conversation beyond Camp Prosperity. So as you all know, across the country, communities are still dealing with the household financial and health challenges brought on by the pandemic. We know that effective government at every level, whether it's federal, state, or local, play a vital role in social, economic, and physical well-being of our communities. So now it's more critical than ever that we are equipped to organize and mobilize to engage legislators to advocate for policies that lead us to a more just future. So that is really the reason that we do Camp Prosperity year after year. And this week with this series, we'll be focused on data and the role that it plays in effective advocacy to be able to shape impactful policies. As I mentioned, Camp Prosperity is a 3-week virtual learning series. It is designed for both new and experienced advocates. So in addition to our webinar series, you all will receive weekly newsletters with links to materials and resources that can better help you build out your advocacy skill set. And you can see there on the screen the next 2 sessions that are coming up. Next week, we'll talk a little bit about messaging. The last week of Camp Prosperity, August 1st, we will talk about redefining your role as an advocate, owning imposter syndrome. One of the ways that we try to build excitement around Camp Prosperity is by making it as interactive as possible. We don't ever want this to feel like just a webinar series. And so to achieve that, we've included several ways for you to win prizes throughout the series. If you've been with us for Camp Prosperity for the last few years, you already know we love to award prizes during this series. So during each session, we'll award a prize to the top tweeter. So definitely use our hashtag Camp Prosperity to tweet out any quotes, any data points that you hear today that really resonate with us. We'll also award a prize to a person who completes our post-webinar survey. So we'll draw a name based on the folks who complete our survey for that person to win a prize. So definitely fill out the survey for a chance to win a prize. We'll announce the Twitter winner at the end of today's webinar, and then the survey winner from today will be announced on next week's webinar. Lastly, but certainly the most exciting thing, one of the goals of Camp Prosperity is to better prepare our network of advocates to engage your legislators. So we're encouraging everyone to meet with a state or a local legislator on issues of either housing or child wealth building, so policies like baby bonds, in addition to housing. between now and August 31st, we're wanting you to meet with your legislators. And if you do so, if you fill out our meeting logger, which will be in the chat for you all, you'll be entered to win a complimentary registration to next year's Prosperity Summit. If you attended the summit in 2022 down in Atlanta, you know how absolutely wonderful our conference is. So definitely a great opportunity for someone to win a complimentary registration to next year's summit. And like I said, you can do so by meeting with the legislator and just filling out that meeting logger and entering for a chance to win. So before I turn it over to our speakers, I wanted to, because we are talking about data today, just make a plug for our Prosperity Now Summit, or excuse me, our Prosperity Now Scorecard, which is our in-house data set. I know most of you are familiar with it, but for those of you who are not, it's a comprehensive resource for data on household financial health, racial economic equity, and policy recommendations. You can search the data by location, so things like cities, congressional districts, tribal areas, and you can also download and share your state's outcome and policy reports. So please refer to the chat for a link to our Prosperity Now scorecard. And so finally, I want to introduce you all to our speakers who you will hear from momentarily. Courtney Battle, who is the Director of Strategic Partnerships and Membership for DC-based HAND, or Housing Association of Nonprofit Developers. Tananzing Carmona, who is the David M. Rubenstein Fellow for Brookings Metro. And then Jackson Voss, who is a Climate Policy Coordinator for the Alliance for Affordable Energy. But I believe Jackson will be speaking more from his experience with the work that he did while at the Louisiana Budget Project. For today's agenda, I'll give you all a quick poll in just a moment, and then we'll do a short presentation from all of our speakers to kind of set the stage for the panel discussion that we'll have later, where they'll be the presentation will cover uncovering and addressing community issues through data. And then, like I mentioned, we'll have our fireside chat, which is our panel discussion that will be based on turning insights into action. Following that, we'll have a discussion and Q&A, so definitely drop your questions into the chat throughout today's webinar. And then lastly, we'll end with some next steps and close out. So before I turn it over to our speakers, I want to do a quick poll question to get a sense of who's on today's webinar. So if you all will take a moment to please answer this poll. Does your organization or advocacy coalition have a data or research team or individual? Do you have someone in-house to do data and research for your organization? All right, the poll has closed, but it looks like about 55% of you said yes, you do have someone in-house to do your data and research work, and another 45% of you answered no. So pretty split with a slight lean going to yes. So with that, I will turn it over to our speakers to begin talking about uncovering and addressing community issues through data. Tananzin, I will turn it over to you to kick us off first.
Great, thank you so much. Hello, everybody. My name is Tananzin Carmona, work at Brookings Metro, where I do research on a variety of areas, most recently on Latino wealth. But today I'm going to talk a little bit about my work in my previous life when I worked at the city of Chicago, and specifically on fines and fees reform. And part of it is because it's just an interesting case study in the ways that you can use different types of data to move policy. This project and this work really much started at the local level, where it was community-based organizations and nonprofits. And then I was a policy staffer at this point at the city clerk's office, got together to create the Chicago Fines, Fees, and Access Collaborative. But the reason it actually started was actually through data. There was a community-based organization called COFI, Community Organizing and Family Issues, where they had surveyed basically parents, mostly from the south and west sides of Chicago, on the ways that they were struggling with both poverty, but specifically they were focused on debt. And the topic that came up over and over and over again was parking ticket debt. Now, when we talk about fines and fees, it can encompass all sorts of things. You know, fees can be fees for services that government charges, and then fines are things like parking tickets. And the reason, again, we focus on parking tickets in this whole fines and fees landscape is because this was the space where we had data. And so when these parents kind of showed that this was an issue that was emerging, another organization, a nonprofit, the Woodstock Research Institute, started to do some research where they were able to FOIA the city of Chicago government to get access to parking ticket data, and they were to map where you see more parking tickets and where you see more debt due to parking tickets. And because Chicago is so segregated, they were actually able to see very clearly that it was in the south and west sides of Chicago, which are predominantly Black and brown communities. And so you kind of combine this qualitative data of what was happening on the ground with parents saying, like, this is a real issue and it's impacting our ability to survive, pay for other things, groceries, utilities, because we're so busy paying for parking tickets. But then on the other hand, you had this combination of mapped data with zip codes. And so that together led to a story by ProPublica, who was able to really use that data, and they even did their own analysis of the FOIA government data to essentially tell a story and spark the interest of policymakers across the city. I was one of them. So what you see here is actually, after all of that was happening, we decided we needed to collect not only more data, research the issue, but we held working group meetings, but then also focus group meetings all across the city to gain more insights from Chicagoans to see what they were experiencing. We launched a data portal to see, and from different zip codes, again, what Chicagoans were experiencing. So we were able to get all sorts of data on top of what we already had. And part of it was we were specifically focused on the type of data that could provide context behind the numbers, because when government stakeholders, not all of them, but some of them, were looking at the inequities in parking tickets or seeing that there were some areas that had more parking ticket debt, they were saying, well, it's because people are intentionally skirting the law and that's why they're accumulating all this debt. But when we talked to not only these parent leaders, but then all Chicagoans, we actually found a lot of anecdotes of people trying to get in compliance with the law, but they couldn't because you only had 30 days to pay this really high parking ticket fee. And if you didn't pay it within that timeline, that debt doubled. And so people were finding themselves spiraling and not being able to afford the debt. So anyway, all this to say, over a 6-month period, we were able to, collect all of this information. We were even able to entice legislators to really look at this because we were able to show through their different wards what they were, their residents were experiencing. And it ended up leading to significant reforms around the way that we issue parking tickets in Chicago. There's still more work to be done. But then at the state level, they also took notice, and we were able to end the process of revoking driver's licenses for parking ticket debt. So anyway, all of that to say, this story just is supposed to maybe cause some reflection. Ask yourselves, what kind of data do I have? What data do I need? How do I collect it? And there's different forms of data. There's the government sources, and so that's everything from federal, state, and even local. There's ways to even get a hold of data via FOIA requests. You can get data collected and analyzed by nonprofits at the local or national level. The media, in this case, ProPublica, did their own analysis of data, and that was really useful in terms of putting it into articles in story form. And then there's also, we had academic institutions help us out with the analysis. And I think just last but not least, never forget about qualitative data. Use this data to provide the context behind the numbers and to tell stories that'll help move legislators in one direction or another. So I will end there and pass it on to my colleague, Jackson.
Thank you. And a good handing off point, because I think that so much of that is all you need to know, I think, about this process and how to think about collecting and using data. I think just really quickly, my name is Jackson Voss. I'm based in Lafayette, Louisiana. I work for the Alliance for Affordable Energy now, but these are actually charts and graphs that I produced while I was working at the Louisiana Budget Project, which is an organization that focuses on state budget and tax issues, as well as helping to advocate on behalf of low-income Louisianans. And so a lot of my work, I was the economic opportunity policy analyst at the time. A lot of my work really focused on wages and wealth disparities, and also the rights of workers and working people. And so part of that work also included a campaign where we helped to kind of advocate on behalf of the advanced child tax credit, and in the hopes of earning or getting legislators to pass a state version of the child tax credit, which Louisiana does not currently have. So these are just some examples of graphs. Data can really help us to show what people are going through now. And that's what these charts are showing. What this first chart to the left of the screen is showing what percentage of workers are in jobs that pay less than $15 an hour, which is one of the goals for raising the federal minimum wage. Is not quite a living wage in most places, including parts of Louisiana, but would be a vast improvement. And as this information shows, this is all collected from, this is data that was collected by Oxfam America using census data and other economic data to kind of to make the case that people's wages are too low. And as you can see, it's disproportionately low for women and people of color in particular, both in the United States and in Louisiana specifically. This other chart next to that, this is showing the distribution of, this is really a budget chart. This is a chart built off of data collected by the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities about how Louisiana spends its TANF dollars. And TANF is the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program, which serves the lowest income people in the state and in each state. And as you can see from this distribution, the state of Louisiana is spending a lot of its TANF dollars. It's a block grant, so the state gets to decide how to spend these dollars. Spends a lot of this money on activities that are, arguably related to helping improve people's conditions and alleviate poverty, but are not actually focused on providing the direct assistance that is usually anticipated. So there's not money being provided directly to the lowest income families in Louisiana. So this next page then shows the other ways that we can use data, and the ways that I use data in my job, which was to kind of show what could be for better and for worse, right? So using data to show legislators and decision makers what are the positive impacts of certain policies and what could be the negative consequences of letting something become law. So this first chart on the left is a chart that I made for a blog on baby bonds. We were supporting a bill that would actually create a study for the state looking into how much it would cost the state to create a baby bond program. And as you can see here, what we're trying to show basically is that even if you have a pretty conservative estimate of rate of return for investment, that baby bonds could provide some meaningful financial support for low-income families. And then this other chart is a chart that was made in response to a bill that was passed out of the Louisiana State Legislature that would reduce the number of weeks that people are eligible for unemployment insurance. And so the purpose of this chart is really to show legislators that the changes that this law requires would not only reduce the number of weeks that people could use unemployment insurance, but would reduce the amount of money that they would get from unemployment insurance and actually make it harder for people to remain connected to the economy and make it less likely that they find a job before they run out of assistance. So the way that we think about data, especially down here and in legislative advocacy, is really focused on telling people's stories quantitatively or qualitatively. It's good to include stories about people's experiences. It's also good to show numbers. And sometimes that can be what helps to persuade legislators to do something good or to avoid doing something that would be bad. Excited to continue the discussion as we go on, but I'll pass it on to Courtney to talk about the incredible work that she's done.
Thank you, Jackson. So greetings, everyone. My name is Courtney Battle, Director of Strategic Partnerships and Membership, and pleased to be here with you all and have the opportunity to share a little bit about our tool, what we call the Housing Indicator Tool, or the HIT for short. Just to provide some context, HAND is a membership association for groups and individuals that are working in the housing and community development space. And in addition to training our members, providing capacity building and convening them on a regular basis, we also have this advocacy arm, which the primary offshoot of that is the Housing Indicator Tool. So I'm going to share a little bit about that today. Next slide. So here we just have some staggering data, which I'm sure is not new information to each of you on the call, but just really outlining the housing challenges that we see not only in our region, but across the nation. And just, we'll outline this bottom stat here. Almost 50% of American renters are spending 30% or more of their income on housing, which we call housing cost burden in our space. And so, as many of you know, if you live in the DC region or elsewhere, as it's a national issue, this is quite a serious challenge that we continue to see. Next slide. Okay, and so all of these are different obstacles that we see to providing quality, safe, affordable housing to our communities. And so it's not just this thing that happened overnight. Decades of systemic racism and policies and programs that have been put into place really are, at the root of why our communities look like they do today and why we're seeing these challenges. Next slide. Okay, and just some of the themes that we see in the tool. For context, we release the tool each year in the spring, and it's in its third installment now, so we're really excited to see that growth of the tool. And the way that it's set up, we have a number of different jurisdictions across the DC metropolitan region that participate and provide data on their housing production preservation from the last year. And so at this point, we actually have 4 years of data because we lost a year with the pandemic. But I say all that to say, just provide some context of this data that I'm going to show you over the next few slides. And so one of the great things about the tool is that the data will allow you to see themes across this period of time. So these slides will show some of the themes that we've been seeing within the past year. So one of them is that 4 in 5 renters with very low incomes have an unaffordable rent, that housing cost burden that I mentioned previously. We can move to the next slide. Another theme that we're seeing, both regions in the greater DC region as well as greater Baltimore are losing low rent units. And we actually, that's where we're seeing the greatest need, is that lowest income band, 0 to 30% area median income. So really our most vulnerable populations. Next slide. We're also seeing that we need to increase the housing supply. It's not just preservation, but production of new units. We need 25,000 units each year to meet this goal of 375,000 units by the year 2030. That was developed by the Urban Institute and the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments. It's a mouthful. But these targets have been developed and benchmarked, and that's, the consistent theme that we're seeing, that we really need supply. Next slide. Okay, next slide. And then again, just some other themes that we're seeing over the past year. The region was able to meet its production target in 2022, just over 25,000. We also see that 6 jurisdictions were able to exceed their respective targets in the last year. So that's definitely a positive development, and using data to really highlight those strengths as well as the areas for growth is, I think, super important and something that we really like to do through the HIT. Also, most multifamily production was concentrated in a few jurisdictions. So this is the area of improvement that we see, that we can't just have it concentrated in just DC or, just Montgomery County. We need it throughout the region because we know that there's need throughout the region. Also, renewed focus on affordable housing production for that lowest income band that I mentioned. As you can see, that's where the lowest amount of units were produced. So really using that data to see where the needs are, where the most need is, and then being able to deploy resources, advocacy, policies in that direction. Next slide. And then also some additional themes that we saw: about 10% of new units in the DC region and 8% in the Baltimore region were affordable in 2022. So again, speaking to the need for that lowest income band. And then 10 greater DC jurisdictions prioritized locations that were accessible to transit and activity centers. So that's also a huge plus and positive development that we saw. Next slide. And across DC and Baltimore regions, nearly 5,000 units were preserved in 2022. And we also see a number of over 36,000 affordable units that are in the pipeline, So it's great to see that progress that's happening. And with each passing year, seeing the excitement that our jurisdictions have around this issue, I think being able to really visualize where everyone is, where the region stands as a whole, and kind of compare and contrast, because the tool does allow you to look at how's DC doing and how's, this other jurisdiction doing, putting them next to each other to see, what's working, what's not, and that sort of thing. Next slide. And then another really great feature that I think is important about the tool, it really goes beyond the numbers. Of course, we present the numbers and where every jurisdiction stands in terms of housing production and preservation, but we also are looking at the policies that they have in place to really bolster that, that housing production. And so these policies you see listed are proven tools that we think that every jurisdiction should have in their toolkit to really address this issue. And so when you look at each dashboard, you'll be able to see who has what in place and how that's working for them, what jurisdictions have been really successful, what tools they have at play, and so forth. So this is just showing, how many jurisdictions have taken advantage of these policies across DC and Baltimore. And finally, encourage everyone to check out the tool at hit.handhousing.org. It's free and accessible to everyone. So really encourage you to check that out on your own time. On the left side, you'll see just an example of some of those charts and data that are within each jurisdiction's dashboard. And on the right, I just wanted to call out this Faces of Affordable Housing tool that is also on the landing page that really helps us to make the case and help the user visualize the need for affordable housing. Oftentimes, there's a negative connotation or stereotype with who needs affordable housing. And so we felt it was really important to include this in the tool because that slider that you see at the top allows you to see kind of who is priced out of their housing as you move it back and forth. And these are not real faces. These are AI generated. So these are not real people, but the data behind each person is real. So, whether they're a teacher or home health aide or daycare provider and their income, you'll be able to see as you move that slider back and forth who can afford housing in our region and who can't. And so just wanted to highlight that because I think that's also super important to just highlight that in addition to the numbers, in addition to the policies, that we're really humanizing and putting a visual to what this means in everyday life. Happy to answer any questions and looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Courtney, for sharing your wonderful HIT tool. I hope that people will have a chance to check that tool out after the webinar. Really great and thorough data set that you all have developed there at hand. And thank you all for setting the stage for the panel discussion that we'll have in just a few minutes on advocacy. Wanted to provide the audience with just a little bit of background on your experience and data and where your perspective comes from. So I'm going to pause to ask a question or two before we transition into the panelist discussion this afternoon. So I think the first question, just a question for you, Tananzin, if you would provide the ProPublica link that you referenced. If you can find that between now and the end of the webinar and provide that and drop it in the chat for folks, someone was requesting that. And then a second question here for Jackson. Jackson, could you share your process for identifying the metrics or calculation to select a reliable tool for generating an accurate could-be analysis?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it can always be a little, it can always feel a little intimidating, especially if you're new to data, to kind of identify what is the data that actually matters for the question that I'm trying to answer or for the point that I'm trying to make. I know for me, a lot of times it really does, it depends on the question you're asking, right? So if you want to know, we're trying to promote a policy that's related, let's take the example of the minimum wage issue, right? So you want to know, how is the minimum wage going to impact people in a real material sense? How's it going to help improve their lives? So one of the things that I would go to look for would be, I want to understand within whatever jurisdiction I'm working in, whether it's a state or a county, or here in Louisiana we have parishes. I try to figure out, there's data available from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and that you can use to see at all the way down to a city level, what are the median wages that people are making? How much money are people making on an hourly basis? And that can give you a lot of clues as to whether or not this will have a serious impact. So you also need to understand, you need to kind of walk through the processes. You may be familiar with mean, median, mode. So you want to look at things that you want to understand the difference between a median and the mode and the average of what people are making. You also want to understand, so you might want to break it down further. You might find, okay, so I'm looking at the city of New Orleans, and the median wage in New Orleans might be $20 an hour. And you might say to yourself, okay, well, this isn't really telling the story that I thought that I understood. But then you want to kind of keep exploring. You want to understand, okay, is this the full picture? The median, that's the middle income, right? So for the middle income of all incomes, that's where it falls. So you might want to understand, okay, can I find data on how much the wages are at each decile? So for each 10% collection of the population, what are people making? And you might find out that actually even though the median is 20, all the percentiles before that are substantially lower, and that the other 5, so it's decile, so it's 10, split it into 10 buckets basically. You'd find that the other 5 are not that much higher. So people are making lower wages in general, lower than $20 an hour. And so you'd say, well, so for everybody under the median income, this actually does help them to raise the minimum wage, perhaps. And so really, all that to say, the data is usually out there. You have to become kind of familiar with the data sources. You can have to understand, what's the question I'm asking and who can I go to do this? Oftentimes I relied on partner organizations if I didn't know where to find certain data. So at the Budget Project, we work very closely with the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities and also the Economic Policy Institute. These are 2 big think tanks based out of Washington, D.C. They have a lot of staff and research capacity, and they're able to provide insights onto where to find data, and they often sometimes provide data to their partners as well if it's requested. And so if I was doing a paper on minimum wage, I would say, for anything I couldn't find to answer the questions that I sort of present, like who does this help? How can I figure out where to find this data, either from the Census Bureau or the Bureau of Economic Analysis or some other federal data collecting agency? They would be able to help point me in the right direction. And then you can kind of from there build out the story as you sort of explore through the data.
Great, thank you, Jackson. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our panel discussion, where I have a lot more questions related to data and advocacy for our panelists. So we'll turn it over here. And as I mentioned earlier, please use our hashtag Camp Prosperity to tweet out as you hear quotes and maybe data points that you think are interesting. So the first question that I have for our panelists is, how do you use data to form advocacy agendas? I know that lots of times, state-based advocates, direct service providers will see data sets like the wonderful hand tool, Prosperity Now's scorecard, Brookings data, all this data, and don't really know what's important or how to use it to actually engage legislators or even to decide what to talk to legislators about. So I wanted to ask you how you all use data to form an organization's advocacy agenda. And Tananzin, I think I'll start with you here.
Sure, happy to. I'll speak more to at least the perspective that I've seen and being on the like government policy side and working with community organizers and advocates. I think oftentimes what I have found that works, especially if you're trying to like present something to legislators, is you take data, but you almost find like a story to tell with it, even if it's like pointing out like one individual story to start with. And I think part of it is, I think there's tons of research on this already, that people most likely resonate if they feel like connected to like that one individual person that is struggling with X issue. And once you kind of draw in the audience, you can present them with like the full data to show like it's not just this one person who's dealing with this issue, it's actually a whole set of folks, and you can present it that way. So I think that's just one way. In terms of like then the full like advocacy agenda, I think part of it is like being able to collect all sorts of data. So it's not just the like quantitative side, but you need to be able to tie that quantitative side with the qualitative side that then enables you to present the information. And that can be, again, like I said, all sorts of sources. Like I've seen it really well done from just like nonprofit data, like Kofi did a fantastic job of, they surveyed people in their communities, were able to collect that information. And then that tied with both the like Woodstock Institute and ProPublica information was just so powerful that people weren't able to ignore it. And the way you also can present it too is like use media as a lever to say, you know, maybe legislators aren't listening to this, but the media certainly can tell a really holistic picture with what you've collected.
I would also just add something that we included on our tool that is a really important feature, I think, are just calls to action for different groups and stakeholders. So we don't just say governments or real estate developers, this is your problem to, you know, fix our housing crisis, but we recognize that all of us have a role to play. And so there are calls to action that we've laid out for each of these different groups. So whether you work for a government agency, whether you are a real estate developer, or whether you are an advocate or in the community organizing space, we have, you know, used that data to inform some calls to action and provided examples of how that's been done, or, you know, resources that you can access. So I think that's also a really important piece. Sometimes you just have to spell it out and, you know, kind of tell people what to do, and that can certainly support your efforts for sure.
And then my next question here, I wanted to shift a little bit to talk about policy. We know that data's out there. Obviously, organizations like HAND are developing great data sets. But in terms of using data to evaluate effective policy, wanted to hear from you all, especially Courtney, based on the work that you all are doing at HAND and the wonderful presentation that you gave earlier. How do you use data to evaluate effective policies?
Sure. So as I mentioned, the tool really, I think, is great at going beyond the numbers. So yes, we present that data, but we're also looking at the tools that you have in your toolkit or policies that you have available to really bolster that housing production. So as you go through the tool and look at each jurisdiction, you'll be able to see what they're leveraging, what policies they're leveraging, what they're not, you know, who's using what, who's not using it, what's working, where there's room to grow, and the correlation between, you know, those jurisdictions that are doing great on housing production or have really seen great improvement over, you know, a period of time, what they're doing. I would also say we partner, you know, we release the tool each spring, and then throughout the year after that release, we're working with our members and partners to host different activation programs to really dig deeper into the data, discuss trends, challenges, best practices that jurisdictions and other partners are leveraging. And we also work with HR&A advisors, consulting firm to work with our government partners on leveraging those policies. So once we see how they're doing, we then say, okay, now that we have this data and this information, how can we support you in creating a clear roadmap from here? So I think the data is always a great starting point, but it's also thinking about, you know, how can we leverage this? Where do we go from here? And creating actionable items from there.
And Jackson, I'm going to pause and pull you back into the conversation here to see if you have thoughts on evaluating effective policy with data.
Yeah, absolutely. It can be difficult to evaluate things, right? And to develop things like a success rate, especially if you're providing services that are really important, but maybe you're limited in resources. You might be a little bit of intimidated by the idea of creating some sort of metric to measure that. But I think that it is really important for us to understand, especially for larger scale policies. So I think that especially a lot of academic researchers, economists, will kind of evaluate how a program works based on using pretty rigorous statistical analysis. But you don't necessarily need to get in that far, I think. And I think for our purposes and for advocacy purposes, it's important to kind of develop ways of evaluating things that make the most sense for the population you're working with or what you're trying to achieve. And so there's a lot of different ways to kind of come at this, but I think all that to say that it is really important to think holistically, but also very, I think, specifically about what you're trying to accomplish and what sort of things that you might do as an organization. So for the budget project, we usually would evaluate other people's policies, right? So we would say, this is how well this program might work. Here's what this policy might do and how it might impact. And here's how we would say this would be a success. So for example, unemployment insurance, if we found out that the unemployment system is getting people back to work within 6 months, I think that we would consider that a success. That means that the program is working well. It might be very different. So I think to Courtney's point, like the housing sphere has a lot of different metrics of success already kind of built in the field. And so there are a lot of organizations that are thinking very seriously about what does it mean to successfully connect somebody with housing? What does it mean to have the appropriate amount of housing stock in a given area? And so it can be complicated, but I think I would just say it's okay to kind of develop your metrics based on what makes sense for your organization and what you're trying to accomplish.
Great points there. I'm going to move us along to the next question so that I make sure we get through all of them. I kind of wanted to stay on that question for a little while longer, but I think this is also another question that I think a lot of our attendees today will see some value in. What challenges do you all run into with existing data sources from a racial equity lens? And then what are your thoughts on the solutions? And I think I'll start with you here, Tananzin.
Sure. I mean, there are always challenges with this. And part of it is like, are you dealing with federal data, state and local? Like at the federal level, oftentimes like the challenge is like it's not disaggregated enough, or you know, it's missing context sometimes, the way that context is interpreted. I mean, that context issue actually also happens state, county, local data. But I think with maybe more state, county, and local data, the issue is more that they don't have it. They don't have what you would hope would help you, you know, be able to tailor or design a specific policy. And then I would say, especially with dealing with Latino communities more recently on my Latino wealth work, I've actually have found that, yeah, like some communities, the data just isn't even captured, or if it is, like I said, it's like it's not disaggregated. I think the same thing happens with the AAPI community as well. And so what I think some solutions are, I have seen more of a movement towards even just pushing governments to provide data sources or to disaggregate data sources. At the federal level, we are seeing more progress on that, but I do think that as part of any type of racial equity work from an advocacy standpoint, it is worth incorporating even just like fighting for basic data sources. at scale that can collect it in a way that maybe you can't get from like a small organization for like survey purposes. But that to me is the solution, is like we actually have seen successes. People advocate and explain why this collection is important. We actually do see then this attempt to try to collect it.
Oh, oops. Sorry, I realized I was on mute. I'll also just chime in on this question. In terms of solutions, I think what really worked for us was laying out the context and providing that background on the landing page of the tool or in some sort of narrative format to really make the case and set the scene for the user so that they know kind of how we got here, why that's important, and it helps to tell the story of the data and then, you know, what is needed, what action we need to take from that point. So, you know, telling the story of structural racism, how that's impacted housing over decades, and, you know, why that impacts why our communities look a certain way or the challenges that we're seeing. So really setting that scene before you even get to the data, I think has been really helpful to the users of the tool.
And I think the only thing I'll add is the census was kind of messed up by COVID. Although the Census Bureau actually did produce a lot of excellent data throughout the pandemic, especially with the pulse household surveys that helped us understand what people were going through in terms of hunger and financial hardship. Unfortunately, the 2020 census ran into a lot of difficulties that left out a lot of, or made a lot of data that we usually rely on, especially regarding poverty, a little bit incomplete. So there's also a lot of other government agencies that I think have already been mentioned that don't just racially disaggregate and sometimes don't share publicly the data that they do collect. So right now I work in the really in the space concerning utility regulation, and the state of Louisiana does not release data on disconnects when people are disconnected from their utilities, and which communities are most impacted by that, which limits our ability to say, here's where the problems really lie.
Thanks, Jackson. And I want to turn this next question over to you as well, and thinking about legislators who may not always agree with the issues that you focus on. I know that particularly in Louisiana, you probably run into this issue a lot. But how do you identify data points that stick out to specific legislators based on their values?
Yeah, this is always very challenging, especially depending on where you may live. And actually, I think it may be as challenging in more majority Democratic states as well, depending on the issue you're working on. It really just depends on the local context in some ways around the issue. So I would say that we often try to emphasize, especially in a state like Louisiana, there's a lot of political rhetoric surrounding the well-being of families and children. And so that's often a lens and a kind of value system that we try to talk about these issues through. We talk about how poverty and wages affect and impact parents and their children. And so I think that's one way of thinking about it. I think another way is sometimes you want to use data to kind of challenge certain assumptions. So there's oftentimes an assumption that if you're on unemployment insurance, for instance, that you're using the system to not work. And we try to make the case and try to explain to legislators using the data that no, that unemployment insurance is actually the way that we help people to find work, right? And so these are people who've not have lost jobs of no cause of their own. Usually it's something that happened either as a pandemic most recently, or just something that goes wrong in the course of business for whoever you worked for. And so I think there's two ways to think about this. This is that sometimes you want to shock legislators into coming around and realizing, oh, this is not actually aligned with my values. And sometimes you want to communicate something to them like, oh, okay, this actually is a policy that is in line with what I am saying I support.
Sorry, I had a hard time getting to my unmute button. And I like what you said there, Jackson, of using data to kind of shock legislators into X, Y, and Z. Next question I want to talk about, something that you all, I think each of you may have touched on a little bit earlier, and it's that balance between telling stories versus data. And I wanted to get a sense from you all how you all balance using anecdotal as well as quantitative data in your advocacy work, or if there's a sort of sweet spot, or just kind of how you think about the two. And I think I'll turn it back over to you, Jackson, to lead on this one.
Sure, I feel like I'm talking a lot, but I'll try to be quick so everybody else can weigh in as well. I think that, so I showed some charts, all of those were quantitative data. I used mostly census data or other economic data, usually from a government agency or from another nonprofit that has better data collecting or more data collecting capacity than the budget project has. But I would say that it's also, you should never underestimate the power of stories that people can provide of their own experiences. And that was critically important in our campaign around the child tax credit and earned income tax credits. We spend a lot of time talking to, and actually around Medicaid expansion as well. We spend a lot of time talking to people about the hardships they face, but also about how much certain policies have helped them. So especially the child tax credit, we went around the state. It was myself and our partner organization, the Middleburg Institute. I went around the state with Ms. Joyce James, who I think is probably on the call today. And we spoke to people about their experiences using the child tax credit to help meet their needs throughout the course of 2021, that part of the pandemic. And there were a lot of very uplifting stories about people who were finally able to pay all of their bills on time for the first time in years, and who were able to really provide a whole lot more for their families than they had been in the past. And so it was important work and also disappointing work. We did not get a child tax credit passed at the state level that year despite that, but we're hopeful that the testimony that we collected will help us in future efforts to get that policy passed and to bring more financial resources to the families who need it most in Louisiana.
And I was pausing there to see if the other panelists wanted to chime in. Go ahead.
Sure, I would just add, so especially if you're thinking about policy, I often feel that, and this is like working at a think tank, sometimes there's this tendency to try to go like top down. So it's like you start with the numbers and then try to figure out what's going on. And I found that at least with the fines and fees work and other work, it was really powerful to actually start with the lived experiences of people in the communities. Like, what is happening? What are they experiencing? Why? And then trying to find more data to help paint that whole picture to see what's actually happening, and always bringing those qualitative stories along with the quantitative, because truly, like, it wasn't resonating. Like, if you just look at parking ticket data, you're kind of like, okay, like that's interesting. But when you were really seeing like, oh my gosh, this is impacting people's ability to pay for groceries, take care of their kids, like we're doing this as a government, like that's horrible, And so I think that to me, like qualitative is just so powerful because it is capturing that lived experience, but then also, continuing to incorporate it throughout. It can't, I will say that with legislators, especially, like it is powerful, but they also need the quantitative, and often they'll request the quantitative. But you shouldn't be building policy in the first place without really factoring in how people are impacted. So it's kind of like you need both. I don't know if there is a sweet spot, and every approach will be different, but at least that's how we found it with fines and fees.
Yeah, I would agree that the combination of the two is definitely important. I think in the case of the HIT, the anecdotal data looks, we're always thinking about what that looks like or how we can really tell those stories in a way that's powerful, that is resonating with the user and complementing the data. And so I think, things like the Faces of Affordable Housing tool are helpful in that sense. But we're also thinking about, okay, beyond the tool, are there ways that we can leverage stories in a different way that that complements the data that we have in the HIT, but is a separate sort of project. So whether that's a storytelling campaign or something of that nature, we're always kind of thinking about what that looks like. And so I think as the tool continues to evolve, that will also evolve. I think it's something that we have to, consistently be thinking about for sure.
Thank you all for that. And I think a theme there to keep in mind for folks who are on it is that data, just like any other piece of advocacy, is a process. Not data itself is a process, but how you sort of interpret it and use it for your own advocacy efforts really is a process. There is no one right way to do it. There is no correct balance of, oh, we want to have more personal stories than actual quantitative data. Just really figuring out what works for your organization, what best tells the story of the clients that you serve, and really what is best for the legislators that you're advocating to, right? Like legislators oftentimes will have their preferred method of looking at research from their districts. And so final question here before I turn it over to our audience for some questions. I know that there are many burning questions in the chat, so I want to get to those. But I also I wanted to talk just a little bit more about advocacy and using program data to influence state and local budgets. Many attendees on the call today, as I mentioned earlier, are with state-based direct service organizations. And so we're always trying to think of ways to use some of the program data that these organizations produce every year and using those to influence, to advocate for more money for their respective programs. So Jackson, because you're shaking your head, I think I want to call on you first. You look like you have a burning response here. And I'll actually hear from all of our panelists here. Tananzin, if you want to chime in next, and then Courtney end us off.
Sure. Yeah, so the Budget Project is a state budget organization, so they really do focus on these issues, and that's what we did when I was there as well. I mean, I think that the program data is incredibly important, and as everybody on this call, I'm sure is aware, this stuff really matters because states are constrained in what they can spend money on, in the sense that they are not able to print their own money. And therefore pay for a policy out of using something like the Federal Reserve, which the federal government is able to do. So you often have to balance priorities and figure out how to pay for something or raise the revenues to pay for something. And so we often try to use state and local budget data to show, especially, and I think this is not uncommon, but kind of to demonstrate how state budgets and local budgets, whether or not those are really reflecting the values of the people in the state, right? And so this is particularly useful when you're talking about certain tax credits and tax incentives that are available to big profitable corporations, but then there's no similar analog for instance, providing assistance to lower income people or people who are not able to afford to start a business or seek other opportunities. And so I think it can be useful to kind of create this contrast saying, listen, the state of Louisiana gives this much money to ExxonMobil every year, but we're not helping any of our lower income people in this way that many other states do. And so we try to use those arguments to influence policymaking decisions and redirect the state's priorities, because at the end of the day, state budget is a moral document. It tells you what and who we care most about. And so we try to hold people's feet to the fire on that.
I would just add very quickly, less about how it can be used, because I think Jackson covered that really well, and just a point about timing. So budget processes, usually go year round, but typically people kind of come at the tail end. I would say start early and start engaging people as early as possible so that when you have, hit budget time, they've already established a relationship with you. You've made your case, you can present the data, you've understood how people react and where they stand on certain issues.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point about timing. I would just say, to add to both Jackson and Tananzin, allowing the data to be supportive in making the case, showing where the most need is, where there are consistent trends, and providing resources where applicable. We have a resources kind of component to the tool that really allows users to supports users in contacting their elected officials and decision makers, for their respective jurisdictions around this issue. And so providing those resources and tools, where you can.
Great, thank you so much, you all, for this great panel discussion. There are lots of comments and chats in the chat box, and I want to get to those, but just again wanted to say thank you all for lending your expertise to talk about the wonderful work that you all have been doing. And I'll get right into the questions because I see that we have a number of them. Question just for anyone to chime in, no one specifically, but how might a coalition advocate for or put pressure on a local government to collect and or report better data on existing programs? So any thoughts about just the way in which the government collects data and how coalitions can really influence that process?
I would say, I saw it with fines and fees because it was kind of like, here is a list of data like sets that we need. We actually didn't have all of it, and it was really hard to get a hold of some of it. And some of it is it requires you submit a FOIA request. But to have it be done like where it's just something we do annually, or that is just something the city of X does, or county or state. Part of it is making it part of a collaborative or a coalition agenda item. And so, first and foremost, like, why is it needed? What are we missing by not having this data? What could we do if we had this data? What could the government learn if they had this data? And part of it is like also showing that like government benefits, constituents benefit from having this data, and we also miss out when we don't. So you're essentially the same way you would advocate for a specific policy issue, you're essentially creating like an agenda around just the data collection and why it's important.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think it's so important what you said about creating that consistency of collecting the data on a regular basis. So first, it's building the relationships with those government partners to say, hey, we really need this for XYZ. And then even if first time around, for our first year, we didn't have the number of jurisdictions that we have now. And so you might not have that much data to work with first time around, but we've also seen that peer pressure is a tried and true great tool. So once I think that, once momentum starts to pick up, you're able to leverage that and saying, we really would like you to be a part of this as well. So being able to leverage the fact that your peers are doing this, this would be great for you to be engaged as well too, so that we have a really comprehensive look at the data and how we can address this issue.
Thank you all for chiming in there. Some great points on making it a part of the agenda. And then also I like your point, Courtney, about just your peer pressure. I know that works a lot in advocacy, so great point there. A couple more questions here. This is just a general question from Ursula on the call. What method do you find works best when collecting data? And I don't know if Ursula was referring to quantitative data or more story collections, but just your thoughts on what's your favorite, I guess, just method.
So we work with a research partner. We work with the Urban Institute to collect data from our government partners, and what they do essentially is send out a survey at the end of each year for each jurisdiction to respond to, and then we take that and translate it to the tool. So I would say, just finding the appropriate partners, if the resources are there to do that, to help with that data collection, and surveys have worked for us. And with surveys or any data collection, I'm sure there's a level of following up that you'll have to do, especially with governments, to really make sure that you're getting the appropriate data needed. But that's where partners can be helpful as well.
And
Thank
I
you.
would just add, it's no need to reinvent the wheel if you don't have to. So it always helps to do a good literature review. Just kind of search and see if you can find a study that's similar to what you want to do, and see how you can kind of replicate that product. Many of the things I've made have been made by other people for other states, and I have thoughtfully and hopefully graciously stolen that work and repurposed it in a Louisiana context instead. So it's always good to build on other bodies of work.
Thank you all for that. And we have an interesting comment in the chat that I just want to raise up and see if you have any thoughts or responses here. So bear with me as I read it. It's from Carrie. It says, I have heard in a previous presentation that the example of one individual to illustrate a larger problem can go both ways. The readers or audience will focus on addressing the one person situation rather than addressing the larger problem illustrated. Have you all run into that at all, or just general thoughts on that? I know it's a comment rather than a question, but I thought it was interesting and I thought I'd raise it here.
No, that's a really good point. And I think depending on what the issue is, I can definitely see it go both ways. And gosh, when it comes to especially like issues of like economic inequality and housing, I think intersectionality is super important. And so I do think depending on what the policy is, like it will matter case by case basis. And so I think it would be incumbent upon the organization to kind of even just do like that type of internal analysis in terms of strategy. Like, is this what, like how we want to go about it? For us with fines and fees, it really did work because one, this push was very much led by mostly Black and brown mothers in the south and west sides of Chicago, because that's who made up Kofi. And so they had their stories and they were able to tell them, and it was like, this is what my experience was with this. But even with that, they would capture all of these different intersectional issues. So we had, for example, a domestic violence survivor, Latina, immigrant woman, who was saying like, my husband, my abuser, took my car, racked up all of these like parking ticket debt, and it was under my name, so I had to pay it, and now I'm in debt and I'm dealing with it. And so in telling her story, she was able to capture not just what was going on with this policy, but that there was all of these other like structural issues happening in place that were keeping her from being able to get out of this debt. And so to me, like that was a really powerful example that she wanted to share. But at the same time, hers, wouldn't be the like only story. And so we were very sensitive of that. And so it was just kind of like, we did it on like a case by case basis. If people wanted to share their story, in fact, that's actually how they led with this advocacy on this. And it was very powerful. But again, like if you find that it would undermine the overall cause or the overall like goal for a policy objective, then maybe that's not the best way to go. And so, yeah, it is worth thinking about it strategically from that standpoint.
Great. In order to move us along, I'm going to jump in a lot sooner before others chime in. I think because we have some great questions here. The next question I want to ask is, do you find that there's a lot of missing data for Latino communities? And do you see the lack of trust affecting this?
I can answer this one again. So I just recently came up with a report, understanding Latino wealth to address disparities and design better policies. And within it, I go through the different types of data sources that we have to look at Latino wealth. And some of it is like they do a good job of capturing it. Some of it is getting better at even disaggregating data, but there's still more work needed. And then at the local level, sometimes we don't even capture it. And I think at the federal level, it's a lot. I think there's more data because they're actually doing it at scale. And so you're able to try to you have the resources to kind of sample or oversample in some cases to be able to collect that information. At the local level, I think it is a lot harder. And there is a lot of distrust with government. So even, when I was a policymaker, I honestly would partner with nonprofit groups and community-based organizations to collect information and data because they were not trustful of government stakeholders. And so that's where those types of collaborations are super important. And so I think it is certainly an issue, and there needs to be, more data collected with certain sensitivities in mind, especially as it relates to immigration status. But I think there is a lot of good work that is happening to do that in a sensitive manner.
Great, and I know my colleague Joanna just dropped the Latino Wealth report that you referenced in the chat. And if you all have not been paying attention to the chat as our audience, please do so. There are a number of great resources that have been linked there, things that our panelists have mentioned throughout the conversation today. The next question I want to get to is a little bit on city policies, and maybe I'll turn to you, Courtney, or just whoever wants to hop in first here. How do you find the data effectiveness of city policies? Sherry's asking that question. And I don't know if she may be evaluating the effectiveness but that's the way the question was phrased. How do you find the data effectiveness of city policies?
So it depends. Well, in our case, the tool is, it looks at a variety of jurisdictions. So for example, you have DC, but then you also might have a city and a county. It just depends on the classification of those jurisdictions. And so for each of those different areas, we're looking at whether or not they have different policies in place. And then from there, we can use that information to, work with the government partners there to figure out what the best way forward is, and have those conversations. But that's the level that we're looking at, that you'll see on the tool. Hopefully that helps to answer the question.
Yes, thank you, Courtney. Another question here from Arturo, and I know I'm like rapid firing these questions at you all, but we have a lot and there's some great questions. Another question here from Arturo. Let me pause, there's some noise in the background. And that pause doubled as an opportunity for you panelists and speakers to get some water and catch your breath. From Arturo, how can data help in moving federal policies to a local policy in an effective way that reflect the local needs versus the national needs? So I'm guessing, if I can interpret this, I think Arturo means how can data be used to I think mirror some of those federal policies on the local level in a way that reflects local needs as opposed to just focusing on our national needs.
I'm happy to start on this one. I think that especially in maybe a good context for this is the child tax credit, because that is a federal policy that many states have tried to replicate and have replicated, and that many advocates are fighting for in states that haven't yet. I think that one of the useful things that you do, especially with a federal policy, because oftentimes federal agencies collect a lot of data about the policies that they promulgate. And so you can find a lot of data nationally about how the child tax credit affects many, many families. But then they also, typically, these agencies will break down the data to show how the child tax credit impacts families in each state, which means that you have kind of readily available data about how something like providing monthly income or annual income assistance, how that actually is impacting people. And so then you can kind of pretty easily pick the state level data out and say, okay, here's the benefit of the federal child tax credit. Let's take a look at a state that has a state child tax credit. Let's look at Minnesota or Illinois, something like that, and say, okay, this is what these other states have done. And it also, it's an extra benefit, right? It's helped them to decrease child poverty by this much. And you could say, here's our child poverty rate. We think that having this policy would affect it in this way. And so you can kind of make the case in sort of a comparative way, kind of narrowing down from the federal level down and using the data that the federal program provides to help kind of to make the case for why you're trying to have this policy implemented. And I think that can be a powerful thing sometimes. It doesn't, in Louisiana's case, it hasn't worked yet, but I think that we have had, the more that we talk about it, the more people are educated on it. We hope that it will impact eventually the decisions made down the road.
Thank you, Jackson. Another question here from Caroline, and I think this is just your opinion, and I'll just throw it out to whoever wants to chime in here. Data on your organization's program participants versus big data sets. I guess the question is which, do you think is more effective for direct service organizations? Or thoughts on when each of those can be most useful?
I defer to you two.
Well, I would ask when, and I don't know if she's able to clarify this, but when you say big data sets versus program participant data, I guess clarifying what she means by big data sets.
I would think just like national level data or just like census data, agency data, anything like that versus putting out, data on your program participants and, some of that data.
I mean, I could see a value in both. But I think it also just depends on the issue, on what problem you're trying to solve or what action you're trying to push the user or the end recipient towards. So I could see value in both. I think it just depends on what what the goal is, and maybe it's and maybe it's starting with the national data and then drilling down to your program participants to really tell the story at a more local or on a more community level. So I think hopefully that helps to answer the question a little bit, but I could see the value in both.
And I agree, Courtney, both. I was about to chime in during the silence and say just that, both, especially as you're advocating for things like influencing state or even federal budgets. You want to show legislators sort of what their dollars are being used for currently through the program data, as well as more community level data to display just how large the problem is within the community, just how large the issue of poverty or housing unaffordability. So there's painting the picture of here's what we're doing with the funds, as well as like, this is what we've been trying to solve and here's why we need more money. So I think it's a good balance of both, but there is definitely a need for program level data for organizations to not only collect that data, but analyze it and sort of present it in a way that is useful for legislators and for the community to show impact.
Right, and to your point, Vanna, not only yes to everything you said, but I would also add being able to show here's how we can be a leader in this community or this jurisdiction for the rest of the state or the country, so I agree with that.
Thank you all. And Jasmine, I see you have a question here, and I think this might be my last one, unless there is another burning one in the chat that I may have missed. Jasmine, I asked for some clarification on this, but I'm going to ask it aloud anyway to see if our speakers here might have an answer. But Jasmine says, thank you so much for the insightful presentation. My question is, can you point me in the right direction for who is collecting data and what other infrastructure is needed for underinvested communities? I wasn't quite sure what Jasmine was asking, but I just wanted to speak it out to see if our speakers might have a response there. And Jasmine, if you're listening, if you could clarify that a bit more.
I think one answer to this question is that part of the problem is that there's a lot of different people collecting data, right? And so it can sometimes feel like you're searching in the dark a little bit to find, because there's some things that are held by the federal government, some things that are held by state or local governments. There's some things that are trusted resources that belong to neither of those things. They might be run by a large non-government organization or a local nonprofit. And so it really is kind of all over the place, and there is no central repository of data, unfortunately. But I'd say the closest thing, and usually a lot of data, especially when it comes to, and I think that many of us, Camp Prosperity, probably work on things relating to poverty. The Census Bureau is kind of the the closest thing to a central repository for a lot of the United States-based data. And so it is probably the resource I've used most often, especially with anything relating to poverty or income and demographic data. And I think that if you haven't used it, the website's changed a lot over the years, but it is still a very useful tool.
Yep, and we also
Agreed.
leverage the census as well, so I would echo that. It's, probably the closest thing to the central resource that we have.
Perfect. And then just the final question here on advocacy. And this is just a matter of opinion. I have my own opinion, which I'll share, but what method has been the most successful for sharing info? And I'm guessing, and by info, you mean by sharing data. And I'm assuming that who is legislators. And I'll just chime in and say, for me, it's always in person. That's always the most effective means of getting information across to legislators, whether it's data or any other information. But I'll let our speakers here, just as a final kind of question, what method do you think is most successful for sharing this information? And she's asking if it's email, in person, snail mail, other, I guess, social media, anything like that.
I definitely think in person. I know Zoom is kind of, or online is what we've been doing a lot of, but part of it is too, you want to cultivate relationships with these people to show, to build that trust, to show them that you're like the go-to resource for said issue, so it is more than just presenting, but also like, how do you establish a relationship? And in person is just a little better.
Yep, I would agree. I think in person is definitely ideal. And as Tananson said, just establishing that rapport and building those relationships. And then everything else can be a supplement to that once that relationship is there. But the old-fashioned way, I think, is still pretty effective.
I'll offer one alternative because legislators don't like to talk to me. So that's okay. It's mostly mutual down here. So I would say the other way of kind of getting a lot of our data across is to capture the attention of press. And in the biz, we call that working the refs, right? And so you're trying to get media coverage to kind of generate public pressure, make people aware about problems in their communities that they might not have been aware of before, or give them the information they need to feel empowered to contact their lawmakers, their representatives in government, so that they can tell them, because I might not have a relationship, but they might be neighbors with a state legislator or a city council member whose attention we are not able to get on our own. And so I definitely encourage people to also think about the public facing part of this. Working the press, working with the press is often a really useful and critical tool for advocacy.
Agreed.
Yeah. Agreed. Thank you, Jackson, for that alternate perspective. And I would just say, don't discount any method. As we talked about earlier, there's no one right way to do things. I know certainly in person can help with just initial relationship building, but social media is a great tool these days. If you can jump on a hashtag, if you've got a pretty decent sized following, get a message out there. TikTok, which I don't use, which my nieces and nephews use, but it's also a good method for getting things out there. But just, whatever works for your organization, whatever gains the most traction for you all, I think is the best method. If you've got existing relationships with staffers, emailing is also a fine way to send them new data. But I think the key here is just whatever works for your organization. And so I hope this was as great of a presentation for you all as attendees as it was for me. I know we're running out of time, so I did want to share contact information for our wonderful speakers today. Their email addresses are listed. This PowerPoint deck will also be shared out with you all, so you'll have their email addresses there. Also wanted to share some next steps with our attendees who are on today. A couple things here. Make sure you complete the follow-up survey. Again, you will have an opportunity to win a prize if you complete the survey, so that's always added incentive to do so. Also mark your calendars for our next Camp Prosperity session, which takes place next week, which is all about messaging, breaking through the noise, strategies to amplify voices and advocacy. It's on July 25th. If you have friends or people within your network who you think would like to attend that session, please have them register. It is not too late to register for Camp Prosperity. And then lastly, make sure you all are scheduling those meetings with your legislators. As I mentioned at the top of the webinar, If you schedule and meet with a legislator between now and August 31st, you will be entered to win a complimentary registration to next year's Prosperity Summit, which you all know that is the great conference that we have every other year. And in order to be included in that drawing, you have to fill out our meeting logger, which we dropped in the chat earlier, and Joanna will drop that in the chat again. But make sure you're scheduling those meetings with your legislators, because again, we don't only want you all to come and get more information and more tips and more strategies for improving your advocacy capabilities, but we want you all to go out and actually utilize those. And so a couple more things, if you haven't already, please join our online advocacy center. Here we make it easy for you to quickly email a legislator, call a legislator, tweet at them. This link is also in the chat for you all. Schedule a meeting, as I mentioned earlier, but it's our one-stop shop for doing advocacy online, and all of you have access to it through our website. And then finally, please join our Prosperity Now networks. If you're not already a part of one of our networks, please do so. We have 4. Our Affordable Housing Network, our Campaign for Every Kid's Future Network, which encompasses things like baby bonds, our Financial Security Network, which encompasses issues like credit, debt, savings, anything under the financial security umbrella, and then our Taxpayer Opportunity Network, which focuses on tax issues. So with that, I thank everyone for joining us. But before we go, I did want to, before I thank our panelists, I wanted to see if anyone had any final thoughts, any closing remarks that you wanted to share with our speakers on data, or just generally encouraging folks in the advocacy space. So I'll pause here to see if our speakers have any final thoughts.
Just thank you for the opportunity to be here with everyone. I think it's a great conversation. Encourage everyone to check out the HIT tool, hit.handhousing.org. And I would, just say stay encouraged when it comes to just if you're just starting out in this space, and know that nothing happens overnight. Building those relationships, building trust with different partners, and getting into the groove of creating a new tool or new data project takes time, and that's okay. But would just say that, and look forward to staying connected with you, Vanna, and the entire Prosperity Now team.
Thank you, Courtney. And thanks everyone for joining us. Hope that you all enjoyed it. Thanks to our wonderful speakers. You all are awesome, and the work that you all have been doing and continue to do is awesome, and we look forward to staying connected with you all. As mentioned earlier, please, all of our attendees, take our survey, and we look forward to seeing everyone next week, where we'll talk about messaging and advocacy. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.